It's the first time I'm giving this talk, and I'm looking forward to hearing your comments and questions. And I was supposed to give some kind of talk, not necessarily this one, a year ago. And I'm incredibly grateful to the department for your patience in working to reschedule and then reschedule again this event. I remember very vividly when I was first asked to move the event from being in person to online, of course, because of the pandemic. At first I said, sure. And then there were reports of Zoom bombings, and I myself had zero familiarity with Zoom. And it was just such an incredibly trying period. March, April, everything felt so crushing that I could not commit to doing an online event. In the year that's passed, I cannot count the Zoom events that I've been a part of, partly due to teaching, simply now having, I guess, the equivalent of about 2 semesters, sort of half of spring of 2020, the fall, and now under my belt, and probably you all are in the same position. So I've done a lot of Zooming, a lot of Zoom teaching, and a lot of Zoom keynotes and invited lectures, and am now in a good place to connect with you. If we do have those technical issues, if I get booted, I'll just call in and you'll still see the few slides that I have. I also just want to sort of remind you, I have not given this talk before, which is nice. You know, when you're getting invited to talk about a book over and over again, you know, as happy as I am to share from my first 2 books, I also want to share new material. So it is both daunting and exciting to share some of my current thinking through cultural sociology and critical race theory. And Rachel, if you do want to talk about mindfulness in the Q&A, I'd be happy to do so because these questions are actually at stake in some of my current work on mindfulness. And for some context, I also want to say that, you know, I began my graduate studies at Harvard unbelievably like 17 years ago. I think that's right, 2004, I can't believe it. And, you know, I was fresh out of college and I wanted to be a cultural sociologist. I went into my PhD with the intention of working with Michelle Lamont, Orlando Patterson, among others. And I embarked upon that as a student, and I suppose as a 21-year-old when I gained admission, embarked upon that with no political critique of sociology, of cultural sociology, of scholarship on race and racism. I didn't even know my own politics. And it was really, you know, as for many people in their 20s, that decade was, you know, just a really transformative period of my life for all kinds of reasons. I did spend a good chunk of that time living in France and completing my doctoral research on the commemoration of slavery. I had not yet discovered critical race theory in earnest. And I sometimes joke that it's, you know, probably a good thing that I didn't discover CRT until coming to Stony Brook. We had a lecture, a provostial lecture. Charles Mills gave a talk, I believe in 2012, the year after I started, on his well-known book, The Racial Contract. And it just blew my mind and changed my life insofar as I began to think about white supremacy in a completely new way for me, and certainly different from what I had been exposed to in graduate school. So that was a significant intellectual encounter for me. Of course, it's been like pretty fantastic to then have a chance to connect with Charles Mills a few times over the years. He's been so supportive for both of my first books. But yeah, if I had discovered CRT as a graduate student, I might not have finished the PhD. I might not have been allowed to, given the politics of my own graduate education. To what extent that department has changed, I really can't tell you, but I can only speak of my own experience. And part of what motivates the reflections you're going to hear this afternoon really are my frustrations, which are a bit attenuated now, perhaps because I have been promoted through the ranks and maybe have a little bit of breathing room in my career at this point. But my frustrations back then with the way we were trained to do cultural sociology and to do research on racism. And I don't think that this is unique at all to my graduate experience. It's the norm. The norm is that if you're studying culture, if you're studying racism, that work is sort of framed as an external engagement. We're going to go and look at racism and anti-racism somewhere out there in the social world. And it is not the norm to actually develop a praxis of reflexivity and deep engagement.
Uh-oh.
With critical race work. Go ahead, Rachel.
Sorry, you're sort of freezing. I wonder if you should try turning your camera off. Do you think that that's a
okay? We can try
issue?
that,
okay.
And you can let me know. Is it just the audio? Is it the video?
Yeah, the audio is fine.
Okay.
Yeah, both were freezing, but you're fine now.
Okay. It might also be okay for my video to freeze if the audio is all right, but I'll leave the video off for now, and we can turn it on in the Q&A. All right.
Thanks.
So as I was saying, I fell in love with CRT and kind of left cultural sociology behind. And it's only been in recent years that I've been persuaded to really kind of come back to the fold in some way. And part of this is because people have reached out to me, you know, folks in the culture section at ASA got me involved in some work some years ago. I'm currently teaching a graduate seminar on cultural sociology at Stony Brook, which has been amazing. It's still strange to teach on Zoom, but I've found that for graduates, the level of engagement has just been really fantastic with our students. And so it's been a great space for me to work out some of these ideas in community, intellectual community with our grad students at Stony Brook. And it's been fascinating for me personally to come back to the literature and come back Black study. So in any case, I very much appreciate having you all and to think with you as I tiptoe my way back to cultural sociology. So my talk is organized as follows. I am going to begin with some introductory reflections on the work of Frantz Fanon, who is a founding figure in critical race scholarship, as well as post-colonial sociology, as Julian Go has astutely explained. I'm then going to present a very, very brief overview of CRT and some of the core conceptual concerns of cultural sociology. And then the bulk of my talk is going to be a close reading of Frantz Fanon's Racism and Culture speech, which then became published as a chapter of Towards the African Revolution. And finally, I close with some questions and provocations that I hope will open up some space for a fruitful Q&A. So I think I can go forward in my slides now. Okay. So in a well-known passage of Black Skin, White Masks, entitled The Lived Experience of the Black, Fanon describes his own encounter with imposed objectification or thingification within the context of colonial oppression. When a white boy at him and shouts, "Look, a Negro," Fanon experiences the psychological trauma of being captured and contained within the denigrating white supremacist conception of Blackness. From a Fanonian perspective, anti-Black racism is fundamentally a question of non-recognition, the refusal to admit the person socially defined as Black, read demonic, inferior, exploitable chattel, into membership of the category human. This is what Fanon also means by the zone of non-being, the ontological obliteration of those trapped within the colonial white supremacist gaze. This is also a cultural dynamic, very much so. And Fanon remains almost entirely disregarded in his homeland of France, in large part due to his cultural and political challenge to white supremacy and colonial domination. The very few French people I know who actually read Fanon as part of their education told me they discovered his work and his pain to revolutionary violence did not endear him to French white intelligentsia. And then there is, of course, the fact of his Blackness, which is to say his intellectual disposability. Fanon was not, however, just a critic of French racism. As mentioned earlier, he was one of the 20th century's most insightful theorists of racial oppression, critical race theory, coloniality, and cultural domination before the advent of what we now call culture essay, Racism and Culture, which
Crystal?
of economic relations.
Crystal, I'm sorry to interrupt you. You're going kind of in and out. And so I think it might be better for you to call in, but can you forward the slide? Because the PowerPoint that I have only has 2 slides and this is the second one.
Way. The racist in a culture with racism is therefore normal. He has achieved a perfect harmony of economic relations and ideology in his environment. In fact, race prejudice obeys a flawless logic. A country that lives, draws its substance from the exploitation of other peoples, makes those people inferior. He continued, race prejudice applied to those people is normal. So Fanon understood that racist ideology and behavior are not deviant within a racist society. And moreover, he revealed the central role of cultural beliefs and practices within the structure of racial domination. And what I want to argue today is that Fanon and other Black social theorists and cultural analysts like Du Bois and Ida B. Wells are all too often ignored by scholarship in the field of cultural sociology, especially in the United States. And I'll say more about that now. That geographic proviso is significant, that is US-based cultural sociology, because the form of cultural analysis that's been institutionalized in sociology here is particularly white, even, might add, than the British version. I'm thinking of Janet Wolff's 1999 takedown of cultural sociology and its appropriation of cultural studies. And that critique still holds today, although there are, of course, exceptions and some efforts to sort of divest from that by cultural sociologists. But I do think it matters that the casual denigration of cultural studies that one still finds in US American cultural sociology involves the specific targeting and undermining of a Black scholar's work. That is Stuart Hall, writing in ethnic and racial studies. Thus, Chetan Bhatt decries, quote, the displacement of the disparaged, formatively Black cultural studies by an allegedly more methodologically robust and empirically informed white cultural sociology, whose main empirical concern, whose habitus is essentially whiteness. Now, much of this critique is not unique to cultural sociology. In order to understand and recognize the dynamics of white supremacy in the subfield or the field, we have to see it in the disciplines. And here the work of Earl Wright II and what he calls Jim Crow sociology is essential, as well as Alden Moore's work on Du Bois's marginalization within the racist and white supremacist politics of US American sociology. But to really account for white supremacy in sociology and academia more broadly, we have to look beyond academia to the broader society itself. And this is where I think critical race scholarship is so vitally important and useful for making sense of what white supremacy means for our culture and for our politics, for our economy, and also how it functions. So what is critical race scholarship? CRT is an interdisciplinary body of scholar activism that aims to resist and overthrow, and they really mean it, racial domination. It came out of critical legal studies in the 1970s and early 80s, drawing upon civil rights, the work of civil rights lawyers and legal theorists like Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell, Mari Masuda, Cheryl Harris, Richard Delgado, among others. Since then, CRT has grown across multiple fields, including the social sciences. In addition to its overtly activist agenda, critical race scholarship challenges claims of colorblindness and race neutrality, particularly in the law, and centers the voices and stories and narratives of Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color. It also explicitly names and critiques white supremacy as a system of power, as well as the techniques of denial and avoidance that are used to obscure the social, economic, and political realities of white domination. In my own work, I build on Charles Mills' theorization of white supremacy to define it as the social, political, and economic dominance of people socially defined as white. And Mills has been, of course, so helpful in thinking through the epistemological dynamics of white supremacy, not just epistemic dominance of people socially defined as white, but also the forms of ignorance. So epistemic or epistemological ignorance is what Mills is especially known for as a critical race philosopher. Although CRT emerged after the civil rights movement, its political and intellectual genealogy extends back to the work of Du Bois, Fanon, and other early theorists of power, racism, coloniality, and resistance. Increasingly, CRT has been taken up by sociologists of race, racism, and immigration, including Victor Ray, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, Mary Romero, myself, and others. Of course, CRT has been in the news as of late, thanks largely to the efforts of the prior administration to demonize anti-racism and promote a white power agenda. Unsurprisingly, white supremacists and fascists are not fans of critical race work. Many of you are probably aware of the executive order issued by Trump last year that effectively banned federal funding for anti-racist workshops and initiatives, as well as diversity work more broadly. It constituted what the African American Policy Forum called an equity gag order. But critical race scholarship and activism continues unabated, very much in the tradition of Ida B. Wells, who defied white racists even when they burned her newspaper to the ground as a result of her unapologetic anti-lynching activism and social analysis. When I suggest that cultural sociology is, in the main, unfortunately, quite unfortunately, still a white supremacist enterprise, I do not mean, of course, that individual theorists are driven by conscious or intentional racism, and I certainly do not mean that cultural sociologists are secretly Klan members preparing to burn a cross on someone's lawn. Rather, what I'm referring to is the ideological, epistemological, conceptual, social, and economic, as well as political dominance of white gatekeepers in the field, the senior scholars, the editors, the tenure and promotion reviewers, the grant recipients, the fellowship reviewers, the ASA section officers, the syllabus writers, the graduate program directors, the department chairs, and so on. And I'm also talking about what Joe Fagan refers to as the white racial frame, which remains dominant, of course, throughout much of academia, including cultural sociology. So having introduced CRT, let's now turn to a few words about cultural sociology and how its agenda is described by some practitioners.
Sorry, Crystal, I know,
Cool.
so exciting.
All right, that's great because I have a little slide, nothing complicated here, but can you all see this now?
Yeah.
Okay, and I do just want to show, this was Kimberly Crenshaw and Mary Masuda, two of the founders of CRT. So what is cultural sociology? So interestingly, cultural sociology in the US emerged at about the same time historically as CRT, the last 2 decades of the 20th century. And as mentioned earlier, the field was initially defined by the Jeffrey Alexanders and the Michelle Lamonts of the world against humanistic approaches in cultural studies, that there was this sort of arrogant dismissal of cultural studies as insufficiently rigorous and so on. And cultural sociologists tend to also draw boundaries, but this is maybe a whole nother topic, but against sociologists of culture. But for our purposes today, I'm discussing the two as interrelated. In her recent book, What is Cultural Sociology, came out last year, Lynn Spillman emphasizes the field's focus on meaning making, as well as, quote, rituals, symbols, values, norms, and categories. She identifies 3 foundational assumptions within cultural sociology. 1, that, quote, humans are meaning-making creatures, and that meaning is an essential component of all human groups and human action. 2, that culture cannot be reduced to biological processes. And 3, that culture is produced through collective social dynamics, not merely the product of individual subjectivities. Spillman further defines 3 research areas of interest within the field of cultural sociology: cultural forms, for example, cultural objects, signs and symbols, art. Cultural sociologists, from this perspective kind of outlined by Spillman, thus assert that meaning and interpretations are produced through social interaction and set about to study the social dynamics, structures, organizations, and institutions that shape the production of meaning. One of my core claims is that Black thinkers like Du Bois, like Ida B. Wells, but also Anna Julia Cooper and Frantz Fanon were all foundational, not just for sociology writ large, as has been increasingly argued in recent years, but also specifically for the field of cultural sociology. But you wouldn't know that from taking a typical course on the subject at the graduate or undergraduate level, unless you're taking it with a certain kind of professor, like me, but also others who are trying to do more critical work. But that approach is non-dominant at this point. And while there has been a gradual reclaiming of these intellectuals' work in sociology, I'm not aware yet of any effort to really trace and excavate the contribution of a range of Black social theorists to cultural sociology. And if it exists, please do let me know, because I really am working on this topic and some projects that I'm happy to talk about more in the Q&A. But just to take one example, Patricia Madu Lingerman and Jillian Nybrook rightly acknowledge Ida B. Wells and Anna Julia Cooper among the women founders of sociology in the United States. They also reveal Wells and Cooper's contributions to Black feminist thought, as well as the sociology of power, difference, and domination. But they further make the claim that both of these Black women were on the forefront of theorizing interpretive sociology, theories of ideology, and manners, morality. And while they do not describe these contributions in terms of cultural sociology, I think the label applies. How else are we to understand Ida B. Wells' analysis of lynching in A Red Record, if not as a profound critique of the culture and deadly consequences of white racism? My critique of the whiteness of cultural sociology might seem odd or even misplaced, given that there is actually no shortage of scholarship in the field of cultural sociology in the US that purports to engage with concepts like race and racialization and racism. And indeed, I have, in my graduate experience, I was part of research teams in cultural sociology looking at anti-racism globally. And so given the plethora of such engagement, what do I mean by the formulation of white supremacist cultural sociology? And can people of color practice white supremacist cultural sociology? Preview, spoiler alert, my answer is yes. But to begin with, cultural sociology tends to engage with race rather than with more critical concepts like racism and racialization and white supremacy. To take a few concrete examples, consider the American Journal of Cultural Sociology, based at Yale, still relatively new, established in 2013, I believe. In my own review, I found 89 of the journal's articles mentioning race in some way, shape, or form, 40 mentioning racism, only 4 that address racialization, and 10 that address white supremacy. The Cultural Sociology Journal, published by the British Sociological Association, a bit older, established in 2007, I found 145 articles mentioning race, only 59 mentioning racism, 9 addressing racialization, and a mere 6 that acknowledge white supremacy in some way. What this means, among other things, is that even work on the cultural sociology of racism tends to avoid the topic of white supremacy. And there's a lot more published research in cultural sociology, generally speaking, on race that doesn't even address systemic and structural and institutional racism. But I'm not mainly interested in whether texts use certain words or not. At least that's not my main preoccupation. Indeed, Du Bois, Fanon, Wells, and Cooper developed their own cultural analysis before our contemporary racial lexicon emerged. I am, however, interested in what we miss when Black cultural theorists are dismissed, ignored, or underread. I'm interested in the cultural factors that are at stake in the maintenance of white dominance in syllabi and publications and preoccupations of the field. The white supremacy of cultural sociology that I'm critiquing is also a matter of method. How are Black communities, Indigenous communities, and communities of color engaged in this work or exploited? To what extent do cultural sociologists, quote, of race or even racism, actually embrace anti-racist politics and praxis? And how are our concepts operationalized or even weaponized vis-a-vis communities of color? Here I'm thinking of Tarayoso's critique of how Bourdieu's notion of cultural capital has been taken up by scholars in ways that perpetuate a deficit model of the culture of so-called non-dominant groups. As she notes, quote, Bourdieu's theoretical insight about how a hierarchical society reproduces itself has often been interpreted as a way to explain why the academic and social outcomes of people of color are significantly lower than the outcomes of whites. She continues, the assumption follows that people of color lack social and cultural capital required for social mobility. As a result, schools most often work from this assumption in structuring ways to help quote unquote disadvantaged students whose race and class background has left them lacking knowledge. So this is the deficit model that comes out of how Bourdieu's notion of cultural capital has been sort of institutionalized and integrated in the field. Yosa's work, along with that of Prudence Carter, sociologist and education scholar, who I'm very fortunate to have crossed paths with at Harvard when she was there before she wisely moved on. But their work has been essential for recognizing the cultural worth and resources of Black and Brown youth. Karita Brown also provides us with an alternative approach to cultural analysis that's grounded in the worldviews and life world of Black migrants. This is particularly on display, of course, in her book, Gone Home, which I'd situate as squarely within the domain of cultural sociology, while also pushing against the conventions of the field. Her cogent and wide-ranging analysis examines how migration and macro-historical pressures shaped the formation of racialized subjectivity for Black Americans in Appalachia. Unlike many cultural sociologists, moreover, she not only acknowledges white supremacy, she also centers the work of early Black cultural theorists, notably W.B. Du Bois. Returning now to Fanon, and I'm going to end today with this sort of close reading of racism and culture. Of course, it must be stated that he was not a sociologist, but then again, neither was Marx. And yet Fanon's contributions to our understanding of social, cultural, political, and psychoanalytic dynamics was deeply foundational, and yet has still really yet to be taken up seriously by the subfield of cultural sociology in the United States. And this is true even though Fanon has an extensive readership in US academia, far greater, as noted earlier, than in France, even his homeland, more specifically of Martinique. Julian Go situates Fanon as a post-colonial social theorist. And building on Go's work, I would further specify that Fanon's contributions to cultural sociology are still largely overlooked. In fact, if we look closely, we find a power analysis of cultural production, domination, and liberation interwoven through his oeuvre. Fanon's analysis of revolutionary violence is, of course, well known. What's perhaps less acknowledged is the cultural element of his liberatory vision. For Fanon, resistance involves what Go describes as, quote, a fundamental cultural transformation, or what we may think of as an ontological reordering of the world, a reconfiguration of what it means to be human. In The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon writes that the struggle for freedom does not give back to the national culture its former values and shapes. This struggle, which aims at a fundamentally different set of relations between men, cannot leave intact either the form or the content of the people's culture. He continues, after the conflict, there is not only the disappearance of colonialism, but also the disappearance of the colonized man. This new humanity cannot do otherwise than define a new humanism for itself and for others. As Go observes, Fanon developed a theory for the ending of colonial domination as inextricably linked to cultural renewal and what Go refers to as mutual respect and true cultural exchange, what Fanon describes as an opening of oneself to the other. It is for this reason that Go characterizes Fanon's intellectual and political interventions as embodying post-colonial cosmopolitanism. Now, cultural sociologists tend not to engage seriously with Fanon's work. You will not find it, generally speaking, taught in graduate seminars and undergraduate courses on cultural sociology, particularly those courses perhaps, but not only, taught by white gatekeepers. Jeffrey Alexander, to take an example of a prominent cultural sociologist who has engaged with Fanon, doesn't actually engage with his work so much as a theorist of culture. Instead, he analyzes Fanon as a dramatic intellectual an object of analysis for his own cultural sociology. Alexander concedes that Fanon developed a conceptualization of cultural domination. This is in a 2016 article he published on dramatic intellectuals. And he even deigns to admit that the Martinicans advanced new ideas. But in Alexander's view, Fanon's ideas were influential not because of their originality, but as a result of their, quote, performativity. And so Alexander does what he is wont to do, that is, reduce Fanon's work to a semiotic struggle between binaries, the so-called sacred and profane. In the vice grip of Alexander's strong program in sociology, Fanon is forgotten as a cultural theorist and instead constructed as an almost religious figure, a revolutionary martyr whose work required the qualities of performance and drama in order to be taken up by Black Power activists, political radicals, and intellectuals of the 1960s. Alexander's account, and I would recommend taking a look at this article, Dramatic Intellectuals, if this is up your alley. But Alexander's account of cultural pragmatics also attempts to explain the supposed dissipation of Fanon's work in the post-civil rights era. He points to the efficacy of nonviolent movements and political transfers of power over revolutionary and radical approaches. Quote, in the era of multicultural difference and cultural hybridity, Alexander writes, academic interest shifted to Fanon's 1952 work on racial stigma, Black skin, white mask. Interestingly, Alexander describes those political and intellectual shifts without mentioning at all any of the efforts of intelligence agencies and reactionary forces to infiltrate, disempower, destroy, and even murder radical Black leaders across Africa and the Americas, among other regions of the world. Accordingly, Alexander writes of Fanon's dramatic death without mentioning perhaps its most dramatic element, the fact that Fanon died in the custody of the CIA. This fact is well known to scholars of Fanon, yet curiously absent in Alexander's narrative analysis of semiotics and dichotomies. But it's worth taking a slight detour here to consider the political and cultural implications of what is left unsaid, unacknowledged, and perhaps even unthought in cultural sociology that claims to address in some way race or racism or even coloniality, while remaining very much within the cultural and political contours of what Fanon calls the white racial frame. There's a fascinating and strange piece that was recently published in the American Historical Review by Thomas Meany, entitled Fanon and the CIA Man. And those of you who follow me on Twitter, if there are any of you who follow me on Twitter, you might know that I went down this rabbit hole sometime last year. But Meany actually interviewed Fanon's CIA handler, a man named Oliver Iselin, who only died in 2017, a year after the interviews took place. Fanon's CIA handler was born only 2 years after him, 1927. And at the time of his death, well in his 90s, he was living in a mansion on a 500-acre property. Fanon died at the age of 36 in 1961, and the care provided by this white, male, Harvard-educated agent. Somewhat surprisingly, perhaps, Iselin referred to himself as anti-imperialist. According to Meany, Iselin thought of himself as 100% with the nationalists and opposed to French colonial policy. The politics of French colonialism were moved to front and center of U.S. foreign policy debates, in any case, by Senator John F. Kennedy with his speech on Algeria in 1957, not even a full year after Fanon delivered his famous racism and culture speech in September of 1956 at the Congress of Negro Writers in Paris. It's worth noting that Du Bois was invited to attend that 1956 event and would have crossed paths with Fanon there if it had not been for the fact that the U.S. government revoked his passport. Literary scholar Juliana Spar has written an entire book about the telegram that Du Bois sent to the Congress to be read at the event. In it, Du Bois wrote that, quote, any Negro American who travels abroad today must either not discuss race conditions in the United States or say the sort of thing which our State Department wishes the world to believe. The government especially objects, he continued, to me because I am a socialist and because I believe in peace with communist states like the Soviet Union and their right to exist in security. Returning to JFK's speech on Algeria, again delivered in 1957, this was a very peculiar cultural and political moment. It's just 3 years after the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision, in the thick of the civil rights movement. The Montgomery bus boycott occurred from 1956 to 57. The jury segregation was still very much entrenched culturally and not just in the South. It's the era of Wilma Rudolph and her record-breaking performance at the 1956 Olympics. And when she comes home to Clarksville, Tennessee, she personally desegregates her own town's ticker tape parade, which had never happened before. So it's this moment of intense racial reckoning and continued oppression unfolding alongside new advances in civil rights activism. And we're also in the thick of the Cold War. And so JFK's peculiar speech in Algeria actually critiques colonial domination in the Francophone world. And it's within this sort of thoroughly hypocritical and perhaps even cynical context of Kennedy's anti-colonialism, right, which, was unfolding right alongside continued settler colonialism and white supremacy here, that we find Frantz Fanon's white American CIA agent similarly claiming solidarity with the nationalists. Indeed, this pseudo-pro-nationalism, strictly with regard to colonized people outside of the US, and certainly not within its borders, expressed by Fanon's handler aligns with the agenda that JFK described in that 57 speech. And it so happens that Kennedy was president of the United States when he was brought to the US in 1961. The CIA had an agenda in Algeria, and it involved supporting nationalists in North Africa. And that's where Fanon somehow comes into view. The fact that Fanon died in CIA custody, that he was denied medical treatment for at least a week by US authorities while suffering and deteriorating as a result of leukemia, the fact that his handlers strangely appears at not only his funeral, but also the burial in Algeria and the dinner afterwards with the Algerian army. It all suggests to me that there was quite a bit more going on with regard to the reception of Fanon's work and its influence in the United States and globally than the watered-down version of events we see in Jeffrey Alexander's narrative description of Fanon as a dramatic intellectual. Black power activists and revolutionaries in Algeria were not the only ones with an interest in shaping the perception of Fanon in life and in death. Our own government had a stake in these things, and this is well known. So much so, in fact, that Fanon's CIA file remains classified to this day. But Fanon was not only of interest to the CIA, he was also of interest to Pierre Bourdieu. As Julian Go notes, Bourdieu read and engaged with Fanon, more so, I suspect, than most practicing cultural sociologists. And so now I'd like to close, although it will be a bit of an extended close, but I'm going to end with closely reading some portions of Fanon's cultural analysis in that seminal 1957 speech, Racism and Culture, that was been published. It is criminally underread and undercited by US American cultural sociologists. And that just might have something to do with these dynamics of epistemological ignorance that I've been discussing. Fanon's speech turned essay, in my estimation, is easily one of the most incisive and insightful modern meditations on the intimate connections between colonialism, racial oppression, economic exploitation, and cultural domination. Fanon begins with an insight that remains inaccessible to many sociologists, cultural and otherwise. To study the relations of racism and culture, he notes, is to raise the question of their reciprocal action. He then begins to explain the emergence of subtle forms of racism in the 20th century as the consequence of shifts within economic forms of exploitation and dispossession. For Fanon, pseudoscientific racism and biological essentialism are only the most vulgar, in his words, primitive or simple forms of racist ideology. Speaking once again in 56, Fanon points to, quote, developments of the past 30 years as explaining shifts in racist ideology, culture, and practice. He says the memory of Nazism, the common wretchedness of different men, the common enslavement of social groups, the institution of a colonial system in the very heart of Europe, the growing awareness of workers and the colonizing and racist country, all of this has deeply modified the problem and the manner of approaching it, the problem of racism. For Fanon, racism is not merely an attitude or even an ideology, as many people continue to believe, sort of the idea of racism as being about your feelings or only about prejudice. Rather, for Fanon, it is, quote, one element of a vaster whole, that of the systematized oppression of a people. In asking the question, how does an oppressing people behave, as he does in the piece, he then proceeds with an analysis of racist and colonial destruction of cultural values and ways of life. Throughout racism and culture, Fanon employs a socio-historical and cultural framework to advance a critique of individualist notions of racism, particularly discourses that represent racism as an individual or psychological phenomenon. He advances along several lines of intertwined theorization, seamlessly blending economic, sociological, cultural, and colonial exegesis as he shifts between levels of analysis, linking micro, meso, and macro. On individualist and psychological approaches to racism, he explains, quote, that such attempts deliberately leave out of account the special character of the colonial situation. For Fanon, this is a materialist analysis, not just of culture, but of coloniality as intrinsic to racial oppression. His analysis of colonial domination as cultural destruction also foregrounds war and militarization as key techniques of subjugation. In reality, he says, the nations that undertake colonial war have no concern for the confrontation of cultures. War, he observes, is a gigantic business, and it's only gotten bigger since his death. What is the primary objective of colonial war? According to Fanon, it is, quote, the enslavement in the strictest sense of the native population. Expropriation, spoliation, raids, murder are matched, he says, by the stacking of cultural patterns. And so what Fanon is making clear here again and again is that racism is itself part of a broader system of colonial and economic subjugation that involves systemic cultural theft and distortion. Importantly, he specifies that colonial and racist domination does not necessarily involve the complete eradication of what he calls native culture. Rather, the aim is continued agony, in his words, continued agony rather than total disappearance. What is the nature of this cultural agony? For Fanon, it is much more than Bourdieu's symbolic violence or even Du Bois's double consciousness. He argues that the culture of the colonized, quote, becomes closed, fixed in the colonial status, caught in the yoke of oppression. Cultural mummification, he says, leads to a mummification of individual thinking. Apathy, noted among colonial peoples, is but the logical consequence. I'm reminded here of Cornel West's work on nihilism in African American culture and politics. Fanon now gets into a really juicy and still very relevant critique of what we now call cultural appropriation. Thus, we witness, he says, the setting up of archaic, inert institutions functioning under the oppressor's supervision and patterned like a caricature. He continues, these bodies, and by this he means institutions and authorities, appear to embody respect for the tradition, the cultural specificities, the personality of the subjugated people. This pseudo-respect is, in fact, tantamount to the most utter contempt, the most elaborate sadism. sadism, pardon. Fanon then goes on to explain the evolution of colonial racism from its most crude, overt, and brutal forms to more subtle cultural degradation and sadism, as he explained. Subjugated modes of inclusion, which we are very much still dealing with, and even in more vicious forms, overtly so, with diversity and inclusion as practiced by institutions that are racist and sexist and oppressive, but presenting themselves as inclusive. Of course, huge shout outs to Sarah Ahmed's work. But so in elucidating these dynamics, what we get from Fanon, right, is this thoroughly structural account of racist domination. And it's also worth noting that he is rejecting psychological and individualist explanations of racism as a medically trained psychiatrist. The brilliance of this wig snatching cannot be overstated. There are countless examples, as some of you may know, of white scholars, but not only white scholars, denying the realities of structural racism, including sociologists. And I'm also thinking of the recent controversy over at the Journal of the American Medical Association, where physicians denied the structural reality of racism in medicine. There's so many lines in Racism and Culture that could have been written today. I'm sure many of you have heard or even referenced or seen references, pardon, to racism as a virus or a pandemic in the context of COVID-19. Well, at one point in the speech, Fanon observed that, quote, "It is a common thing nowadays that racism is a plague of humanity." But he continued, "We must not content ourselves with such a phrase. We must tirelessly look for the repercussions of racism at all levels of social, exacerbated by the coming to awareness and the determination of militant Negroes and Jews to fight this racism by which they are victimized." Fanon also challenged the perverse logic of reverse racism as a concept and a cultural practice weaponized by racists. He said the movement of groups, the liberation of men previously kept down, make for a more and more precarious equilibrium. Unexpectedly, the racist group points accusingly to a manifestation of racism among the oppressed. Overall, Fanon advances a collectivist structural analysis of racism as the characteristic of a colonizing society, interwoven into its cultural fabric, not merely as a trait of individual hearts and minds. And he's doing this in the 1950s. Incidentally, we find a very similar cultural claim made by civil rights activist Martin Luther King Jr. in his 1963 speech, Love in Action. King described the link between slavery and white supremacy as follows. Men, he proclaimed, convinced themselves that a system which was so economically profitable must be morally justifiable. They formulated elaborate theories of racial superiority. He continued, this tragic attempt to give moral sanction to an economically profitable system gave birth to the doctrine of white supremacy. And soon this idea was embedded in every textbook and preached in practically every pulpit. It became, that is white supremacy, according to King, it became a structured part of the culture. This bears repeating. King understood that the ideology of white supremacy was embedded in every textbook and preached in every pulpit, practically every pulpit, and that it was a structured part of our culture. There's a thread between Fanon's structural analysis and this structural understanding of the culture of white supremacy that we hear or we see in King's work as well, and Durkheim's insistence that something that seems as personal and intimate as the desire to take one's own life, suicide in that case, is actually a social phenomenon. We can see this thread in Fanon's formulation that the habit of considering racism as a mental quirk, a psychological flaw, must be abandoned. Fanon, speaking nearly 70 years ago, articulated a prescient critique of unconscious prejudice, a concept, as a concept rather, what today we might call implicit bias, insofar as the formulation mystifies and obscures the realities of racial and colonial domination. For a time, he says, it looked as though racism had disappeared. This soul-soothing, unreal impression, he continued, was simply the consequence of the evolution of forms of exploitation. Psychologists spoke of a prejudice having become unconscious. The truth, he said, is that the rigor of the system made the daily affirmation of a superiority superfluous. And this is where things get really interesting. Fanon continues, the need to appeal to various degrees of approval and support, to the natives' cooperation, modified relations in a less crude, more subtle, cultivated direction. I view this as a deeply insightful analysis of cultivated white supremacy and colonial oppression, how it evolves, becomes more sophisticated and variegated. In Fanon's words, less crude, more subtle. And I would suggest that it was precisely this development in the cultural practice of modern racism that has rendered many sociologists, including cultural sociologists, incapable or unwilling of really recognizing and reckoning with the depth and breadth of racial and colonial violence. In other words, as overtly racist regimes, to borrow the phrase from George Fredrickson, as overtly racist regimes in the West were increasingly challenged and legally dismantled in the 20th century, giving rise to more subtle forms of cultural domination, I think we see a sort of toothless quality to a great deal of sociological analysis of systemic racism, so much so that a lot of, again, work on race still does not sufficiently engage with systemic and structural racism. And so we're still dealing with these dynamics today. And we have a kind of chronic under-theorization, not only of systemic and structural and institutional racism as structured parts of our culture, but also an under-theorization of white supremacy specifically, and coloniality, and we might add racial capitalism, as constituent features not only of our society, but of our culture. What this means, among other things, is that the deeply embedded and institutionalized cultural beliefs and ideology tied to our racial paradigm of white supremacy, this paradigm that has been established in the US and globally, remains largely within the realm of the unthought and the under-theorized, even for many sociologists who are otherwise preoccupied with meaning-making and identities and interpretation and the social construction of reality. Now, I could talk the rest of the day and the night and the weekend about Fanon's cultural critique, but in the interest of time and knowing all the glitches that we had, I want to shift gears now and conclude so that we can open up for the Q&A. So, I do have one last slide if it will allow me to show. Here we go. Okay. So in preparing for this talk and developing my own course, graduate course in cultural sociology, I reviewed a bunch of syllabi on the topic from many folks, including some of the most widely cited scholars in the field. It probably won't shock you to learn that I found numerous examples of syllabi in cultural sociology that teach work that's almost entirely white. I'm thinking of one syllabus in particular. I will not name the scholar. I didn't see one Black theorist listed. That doesn't mean there weren't any, but I couldn't find not even a single one. And this is not unusual. And so we might ask, what political and institutional and cultural factors explain the persistence of white-centered theoretical preoccupations, methodological approaches, citation practices, despite increasing attention to racism and anti-racism in our society broadly, and including the study of culture? Could it really be as simple as simply teaching what you know, what you were exposed to in graduate school? Is the whiteness of cultural sociology and its canon just baked in? Do we expect something as extreme as the election of a president endorsed by the KKK or the recent storming of the Capitol by white supremacists who not only brought Confederate flag with them, but hung a noose, to actually compel more cultural sociologists to maybe consider turning some of their attention to white supremacy, to learn from critical race scholarship and consider the centrality of racism to our culture. I don't know. I wouldn't get my hopes up though. I'm not sure what it would actually take to disrupt epistemic white supremacy, Eurocentrism, and epistemological ignorance in cultural sociology or anywhere else. That is, if the Capitol attack wasn't enough, if Charlottesville wasn't enough, if the public lynching of George Floyd wasn't enough, if the police murder of Breonna Taylor wasn't enough, if the disrespect, beating, and killing of Asian Americans from coast to coast isn't enough, if the imminent destruction of our entire ecosystem as a result of climate change isn't enough, then I truly don't know what is. Can critical race theory advance the field of cultural sociology? Perhaps the better question is whether cultural sociology and sociology as a discipline more broadly will find its way towards social relevance in a world that has never been and will never be white. Thank you, everybody, for your attention, for your patience. That's my talk, and I look forward to hearing from you in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Crystal. That was awesome. Yeah, there's a lot to say there. Maybe you could stop screen sharing and
Sure.
people can turn their cameras on if they're able to. Oh, and there you are. Okay,
I
awesome.
mean, I've turned my camera on, but who knows, as soon as I turn it on, maybe Zoom's gonna kick me out again, but I'm on the phone, I'm here, and looking forward to
Okay.
your question.
Okay, and I'm just gonna say to the audience, if you can turn your camera on, it's really much nicer as a speaker to see human faces and not like black boxes with names in them. Just a, small request. Okay, I'm gonna ask folks who have questions to use the raise hand function under the reactions thingy at the bottom of the screen so that I can keep track of that. And please do feel free to, raise your hand. I have like 100 questions, which I'm just gonna start asking. Usually but I don't see anybody else. So I'm gonna go. I mean, the main thing that stands out to me, it's such a fascinating, I love the way you approach this. It's such an more interesting talk than we often get from like, I don't know, whatever, the kind of standard talk format. This is very interesting. So, but to me, it seems like you're actually making a call, I mean, first against a kind of the radical subfieldization of sociology, because I think that everything you're saying could be said of any subfield, right? Like, except maybe the sociology of race itself, which is, it's kind of stupid, right? Even that might have, we might have something to say about that. So partly there's an issue of subfieldization, and then partly there's an issue of politics, right? Because you're not saying like, let's bring in race as a topic. You're saying, let's bring a critique of whites as a science, right? And that it's not, and so, and you are speaking from this position as a public sociologist and a public scholar. And so I'm just wondering, I mean, part of what I think is happening is that so many of the standards of sociological kind of mainstream US sociology work against having any kind of overt political stance, whether it's about white supremacy or something else, right? And so there are probably subfields that have more of a little bit more of a political turn, but that's one of the reasons I personally find, for example, the field of social movement theory, like typically super boring, because it's kind of fake scienticizing like a social phenomenon that's very interesting and political. Anyway, so I'm just wondering if you can speak to like the broader question of the incorporation of politics into sociological research and writing and publication, even from your own experience as a public sociologist.
Yeah, thank you so much for those questions and for that intervention, Rachel. So a few things. Yes, of course. So there is a political critique here. You can obviously you can link it to a broad critique of positivism and ongoing sort of sociological commitment to presenting the discipline as objective, unbiased, a certain way of approaching positivism. And part of that hegemonic still view of positivistic science is a denial. It's an epistemological, you could say ignorance, but it's also, I think, an active denial of the politics of knowledge production. And so it's also very much about rejecting the work of feminists who for decades now have been showing the ways in which, and I don't just mean feminists broadly, but within sociology, the work of everyone from Patricia Hill Collins to Dorothy Smith and many others who have been unveiling the myths, the mythical status of objectivity in sociological knowledge production. So it's not just sort of the commitment to sociology as a science, but the commitment to the politics that allow for members of dominant groups to pretend as though they're not doing politics, to pretend as though they're neutral. And it is a pretense. And I think one of the things that's been so useful for me in my own intellectual and political development has been to learn from the work of trailblazers like Du Bois, and I think Earl Wright II, especially also Alden Morris and other scholars of Du Boisian sociology who are now getting more attention. Of course, Alden is currently ASA president, but their work has been essential for showing us that we actually do have a model for politically engaged, rigorous sociology. And we don't just have that from the work of Du Bois. We also have it in the work of early women sociologists who are still routinely kept out of the canon in the teaching and learning of sociology. So that book, The Women Founders, that I mentioned, it's fantastic. I only came across it myself a few years ago and have been integrating it in many of my graduate and undergraduate courses. But it's a great historical reminder of the fact that, rewind the clock 120 years ago, you had numerous examples of, yes, marginalized social theorists and people who might have been and were being actively excluded from practicing as professional sociologists in the discipline, but they were doing sociology, politically engaged sociology, with an open commitment to moral principles and morality in the service of improving society and addressing inequalities and inequities as not in conflict with the work of rigorous social science. We have these examples. We only need to attend to them and learn from them. So I know there are some hands in the air. I don't know who was next, but
yeah, I do.
you.
I have the list here. Carlos.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Crystal, for your paper. And as Rachel said, this is an unusual presentation for the sociology department. So we're very delighted to hear new voices and new words as well. I'm not terribly, I suppose, interested really in your remarks on the field of sociology. I gave up on sociology a long time ago. What I would like to really pursue with you is your discussion, your very fine reading of the essay, The Racism and Culture. I mean, I just really want to see if we can engage with this a bit more. As you know, this particular essay was delivered by Fanon in the presence of Seigneur and Césaire, and partly as a criticism of negritude. And of course, the more elaborate and more sophisticated and extended arguments appear in Black Mask and White Mask. And in your closing remarks, you made a very, you alluded to, kind of in passing, but I found it terribly interesting, about how racist forms of anti-racism are problematic. And this is what I want to dwell on a little bit, if you allow me to.
Of course, please.
Okay, so what we have here is, as you began your talk, Fanon's questions, how can the Black subject exist in a place of non-being? And then from that, how can they, if you will, recover the fullness of their humanity? I mean, how can you become full from a place of void, in a sense? And this is really, in many ways, one of Fanon's, if not the central concern, certainly one of his great problems. And this is where he began to think about negritude, which Césaire and Senor were very committed to. And he said that, Fanon said, that is, regarding negritude, that it was, this attempt to try and recover this authentic, essential character of the Black subject was self-illusory, that there's no such thing as an authentic, essential Black subject. But having said that, he also said, it's really a very necessary stage, and it's one we should all support to one extent or another. And his reasoning was that if not, the Black subject, or any subject for that, I mean, you can extend this argument to any group. I mean, he was debating the Black subject, so that's what we're talking about. But he said that it's necessary because otherwise, in the case of the Black subject, they become overly identified with whiteness. They wanna become white, and whiteness encourages that, of course. So then, after he lays out that argument, he says, in a sense, that that negritude is a moment in this process of disalienation, of disestrangement, and that it was necessary, but that when oftentimes others read it, they including Sartre, for example, castigates it because, in fact, everyone knows that this authentic, essential self is self-illusory. It's to go back in history and narrate the grandness and the greatness of any one single culture is absurd. But then he says, let's tolerate it and let's not cut it short. Let's indulge in it for a while, because this is exactly what we need. This is a moment that is constitutive of this new emergent identity that has not yet been able to become public. So let's not be overly severe and critical of it. And I suppose what I'm trying to get at, and it just occurred to me, what I'm trying to get at is, what is the difference between this form of tactical, to twist around Spivak's old terms, this is a form of tactical essentialism, whereas whiteness is strategic essentialism. Strategic essentialism is long-term, permanent, and universal, whereas tactical essentialism is temporary and begins from a particularistic standpoint. It doesn't pretend to be otherwise. And I think that is, in fact, the difference between negritude and whiteness. They begin from very common or similar problematics, but they then diverge and move in different directions. And let me, if I can, close with an anecdote that illustrates this, which happened actually at the New School, which is, of course, as we all know, a very radical place. And what I teach a course, I teach the classical social theory course, and some of my students, I see them here, we read quite a bit of Du Bois, and I'm also teaching a course on democratic anti-colonialism, and we read even more Du Bois there, and Fanon, of course. And I said this to a colleague. I won't name names, nor the department, and the colleague used this example or this anecdote as a way of reassuring themselves and that in fact, the discipline they're in is in fact very open and tolerant. And I said, but really, I mean, it took almost a century, 100 years for Du Bois to be read. And they reaffirmed that, well, this is proof that sociology is very, this discipline is very open-minded and pluralistic, and that we should just get on with life and recognize that, you know, now that I've said it, that sociology is in fact a universal science capable of accommodating brilliant thinkers when the time has come. I mention this because to me, this was exactly what I mean by strategic whiteness. And it is these little comments that are, I mean, I suppose in the lingo nowadays, they call this microaggression. I call it a kick in the ass. But these little comments that are continuously narrated in everyday life is what sustains whiteness as a form of a framework for understanding the world. And of course, if you defy it, you get castigated for it.
Carlos, there is so much, and I'm so appreciative that you shared everything that you did. I took about 2 pages of notes as you were speaking, so there are lots of things I want to respond to, but I'm glad you shared that last anecdote too. It's very common. I mean, I think of those kinds of microaggressions. I'm thinking as you were speaking, actually, of there's like a TikTok and Twitter personality who put out a video that described just this. It was a comedic video, but it described just this dynamic. And so in the video, they were sort of pretending to be a white television presenter interviewing some Black writer, and they're playing both roles in the video. And as the white TV presenter or the host, they say to the Black writer, "What the fact that I have to listen to you today just shows how far we've come." But the idea that as a white person, my engaging with you, or your presence in some way, or the presence of a Black person or person of color on a syllabus 100 years after they publish their work, that the bar is so low for recognition that the sort of most minimal step is turned into a mountain of progress. And yes, I think the distinction you've drawn between this strategic essentialism of whiteness and the practical or strategic essentialism and contingent, I would add, right? It's contingent.
Yeah.
Of the kind of political work that's necessary to resist racialized oppression is cogent. But so that strategic essentialism is, and I think one of the things I still quibble with a bit with Charles Mill's work on epistemological ignorance, even though I love it and I use it in my work all the time, and how to be less stupid about race with racial stupidity is really a kind of a public sociology way of explaining the epistemology of ignorance. But yes, ignorance, I think, I agree with Mills, is a large part of it. There is there is an element of non-recognition of structural, systemic, and colonial racism that becomes culturally embedded. It's not as though folks are sort of, I think, sort of seeing things clearly, like, oh, actually there is systemic, structural, and cultural white supremacy, but I'm just going to act like it doesn't exist, right? There are, I'm not saying that doesn't happen at all, but, largely people who are sort of trapped in this strategic essentialism of whiteness, they have, so their ignorance has been cultivated, right? So we're socialized not to know. And those who pointed out, to your point, Carlos, pay the price, particularly if they're people of color, but even white people who resist these dynamics very much pay a price for doing so. political price. Sometimes they pay with their lives, depending on the context. What you were starting out with early in your remarks about Fanon's critique of negritude. I love, and this is kind of what Julian Go is describing as this post-colonial cosmopolitanism. But there is, I think, in Fanon, this really insightful and, for me, resonates with me, an insightful vision of liberation, which is precisely about, in his words, not being the slave, not just to slavery, but to of history, right? And refusing being entrapped within the contours of identity or even the accumulation of history within oneself. Sort of that for Fanon, liberation is not just about or even primarily about external politics. It's also about internal transformation and liberation and the pursuit of true freedom. And without going too much down this rabbit hole, I would just go back to Rachel, your interest in mindfulness. That last reflection is really something I'm trying to delve into in this project. So it's a project, a couple of projects. One is the book that you mentioned that we're finishing up, an edited volume, and that's an interdisciplinary project. But I'm also starting interviews with Black practitioners of meditation and mindfulness, depending on how they defined it. And the pursuit of liberation as part of mindfulness practice for some folks is something I'm super interested in, especially insofar as the many approaches to mindfulness are very much about bringing attention to the present moment. I'm so interested in how racialized subjectivity is or is not sort of consciously something that Black practitioners of meditation address in their practice and in their vision of whether it's liberation or simply attaining some kind of sense of inner peace, how they make sense of some of these dynamics that Fanon was writing about in his work. So, Carlos, I would love to remain in conversation with you beyond this event, but thank you so much for your intervention.
Wow, thank you. Okay, we're going to take Khalid and Melissa. Let's just take both of their questions, and because technically we're over time, but we're just going to keep going for a little bit. So, yeah, why don't we start with Khalid and then Melissa, and then Crystal, you'll answer both.
Okay.
All right. Hi, Professor Fleming. Thank you so much for your presentation. I think a much needed lecture, especially for our department, as we've had a history of sort of trying to push for more critical race theory in our syllabi. So I can't sort of overstate how important this talk was. I just wanted to, when I saw your title, I thought of the history of cultural sociology, but sociology in general, in kind of being architects of certain concepts that have perpetuated racial domination and racial terror. I mean, there's everything from Chicago School of Sociology, which someone like Saidiya Hartman criticizes in her book Wayward Lives for kind of creating theories of racial containment in the ghetto. And then there's, of course, kind of the infamous Moynihan report and how, perhaps Moynihan is directly influential in creating the theory of the culture of poverty. So I was just wondering what you make of the kind of history of sociologists not only being sort of practicing this kind of epistemological ignorance, as you say, but actually also productively creating a body of literature that then becomes the grounds for new forms of racial terror and containment. If sociology is relevant on a policy scale, it's often been because of sort of anti-Black policy. So I was just wondering if you could speak more about that.
Thank you, Colette. I know we're going to take another question before I respond.
Yeah, Melissa, please.
So thank you so much for this. This is, like Colette said, this is so needed for this department. I feel like I'm starving for critical race theory. Do you think that in light of, for example, Meghan Markle's interview where she highlights racism in the monarchy, that there'll be any change as it relates to the approach to white supremacy as an individualistic, where saying it's about me, you're talking about me as a, rather than the structural problem that is a global problem structurally, and is it even possible to frame cultural sociology or sociology in general from a CRT perspective? There seems to be a canon, you know, for example, Jeffrey Alexander. There seems to be a canon that, and I've been hard pressed to find a sociology course in any school really that engages extensively, sort of intertwining racial theory, focusing on white supremacy. So is that even a possibility? So it's kind of like a twofold question.
Thank you both, Colette and Melissa, for your interventions and great questions. I love both of your questions. So I'm tempted to begin with Meghan Markle for maybe obvious reasons, but I want to actually begin by responding to Colette. And I hope my partner will answer the door for whatever that is. So, okay. Yes. So anti-Blackness in cultural analysis in sociology more broadly. Thank you so much for that observation, Khaled. Yes, I very well, we could have spent this afternoon just talking about that, even before we get to the last 2 decades of the 20th century and the emergence of what, you know, we now talk of as cultural sociology in the United States. Absolutely, sort of anti-Black, white supremacist cultural analysis has been the bread and butter of the discipline of sociology throughout subfields since its inception. And this has, you know, this is sort of what I was also alluding to in, you know, not just Alden Morris's work, but also Earl Wright II, but we can also look at the work of James McKee, Sociology and the Race Problem as a great guide to this. I put it in the chat, but my hands are occupied, but Sociology and the Race Problem is an excellent book that presents like a history of this and certainly delving into, among other things, the Moynihan Report, the Chicago School, the pathologization of Black people as central to the business. And I do mean that, the business of sociology, right? We have generations of academics, not just in sociology, but we're in the social department right now, so we'll talk about social, who have enriched themselves and made their careers off of demonizing Black people. You know, I think now we're sort of seeing the emergence of the last few decades of a different but related phenomenon of, you know, some white scholars who are or view themselves as doing sort of progressive work related to, and I'm going to pause because a lot of the racist scholarship that came out of early sociology was done by white people, including Robert Park, who thought they were progressive. I think that's super important to recognize. They thought they were progressive. Park thought he was progressive, and you know, I think we've got a lot of resources for thinking through how his relationship with Booker T. Washington was actually part of what for him was you know, a dynamic that allowed for him to think of himself as progressive, racially progressive, even as he was producing racist scholarship. In any case, the emergence of folks doing work about race or racism and enriching themselves in so doing, but not actually embracing a politics and practice of anti-racism that improves the well-being of members of those communities. So yes, there is an orientation in sociology that is not sufficiently recognized because the true history of the discipline is not taught in many of our courses, which leads me to the second intervention. Melissa, in addition to your question about Meghan Markle, you sort of ended with this provocation question, is it possible to sort of integrate critical perspectives in our classes and our syllabi? I will say that, yes, not only is it possible, there are people who are doing it. I'm doing it. And not because I was encouraged to do so, but because I realized that there was no way I was going to stay in academia or in the discipline of sociology unless I did that. And I've been fortunate to have had, when I was on the tenure track and an assistant professor, I did, have supportive mentors and colleagues, both at my institution, but also internationally and nationally, who encouraged me to do just that. Even though it's not the norm, there are folks who are doing it. And so I would encourage you to connect with faculty, graduate students, and folks who are doing the work, and it is ongoing work, of making our scholarship, our writing, our teaching more critical. I work on my syllabi every single year for graduate and undergraduate courses to integrate not just more work on race and racism and not just work on intersectionality, but Indigenous studies and work on disability justice and centering the perspectives of trans people and scholars and activists in your work. So it's the ongoing work of learning, I think, that is so important to bring to our teaching. I'd also just say on this point, I'm really excited now to increasingly be asked to do so. I do a ton of lectures and keynotes for universities and organizations, but increasingly I'm being asked to do what I find to be even more meaningful and transformative work. I'll be, for example, working with UC Berkeley this summer with a huge group of faculty to transform their syllabi. Folks working in a variety of disciplines, but to bring in critical perspectives into their teaching and creating resources that the institution can use on an ongoing basis. And so I think there's lots that we can do to support that kind of pedagogical development. Finally, Meghan Markle. Oh my gosh, Meghan Markle. We might have to continue some of the Meghan Markle on Twitter. But I mean, you asked this question, Melissa, so you probably know. And I don't know if it was confirmed, but I saw the headlines about, was it the Queen saying they're going to hire a diversity czar? I mean,
yes. The Queen, yeah, they're hiring a diversity czar. Yes.
We're gonna have to see what becomes of that. I will say I write a little bit about racism in the royal family and my strange interest in Meghan and Harry in How to Be Less Stupid About Race. There's a chapter on interracial love and how it's conceived and practiced and what that has to do with anti-racism. But I will say, I watched that Oprah interview with wine and rapt attention. But I noticed, as many others did, much of what we heard in Meghan's narrative was about the personal slights, right? The individual comments about skin color. And actually, I don't think there was, and that might have been implicit, but I don't think there was really any from Meghan or Harry a recognition of structural or systemic racism within the monarchy, within Britain more generally. I think even the next day in some of the bonus footage, I think Harry said something like, you know, Britain isn't a racist society. So I think there are all kinds of, you know, whatever, who knows? I think there were like 3 hours of interview done, and who knows what was left on the cutting room floor. But then you have how the interview and the discourse is then picked up by the rest of society, right? This is actually a really interesting cultural sociology question. And I will say that when I was, you know, all this was popping off, I was asked to do some radio show in Britain about all of this. And as part of that, I was listening to the callers of many white British people who were calling in, and they were so much more incisive about structural racism in Britain, in the monarchy, white racism, far more than what you heard in the interview from Oprah or Meghan or Harry. And so I think we'll have to see what happens, but I think there will be an opening up of more conversations about structural and institutional racism. Now, does that translate into reparations? Does it translate into meaningful political change? I don't think the monarchy has even apologized for slavery and its implication historically in colonialism and anti-Blackness, to name just a couple of things. So I don't know. We'll have to see. But thank you for that question, Melissa. There's so much in the chat. I don't know if it's possible for anyone to like send me the chat, but I would love to see your questions and the comments that you put in. And I did put in the chat as well, if any of you all want to continue to connect. Of course, you can email me. I'm really overwhelmed with email right now. I somehow seem to be better with tweeting than with emailing, but you could connect with me on Twitter. And I want to thank you all again for hanging in there with all those technical difficulties. I was super nervous about this talk. You said it was unusual for you. It's unusual for me. I've never given this talk before. And I was a little horrified when all the technical issues happened, but I'm glad we got it together, and I appreciate your hanging in there for so long today.
Well, and it's fortunate that it was such an interesting talk that we were actually able to, you know, pay attention to it without seeing your face or your, well, we did see your slides, but for some part of it without seeing your slides. It's a good exercise. You just have to listen. And that was great. And it's so appropriate for what we're talking